Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how range of motion during resistance training influences muscle growth. First and foremost, let's define what range of motion is. Quite simply, range of motion refers to how much the joint angle changes while performing an exercise. However, during resistance training, we aren't measuring joint angles. Rather, range of motion is relative to the exercise we are performing and the muscles we are training. Therefore, we will now define what range of motion means in these two contexts. So exercise range of motion refers to how far our joint moves relative to the lift we perform. Once again, we aren't actually measuring the joint angles, we can simply observe the lift and see what range of motion is being used. For example, we can see how far down someone squats by looking at their thighs relative to parallel, or we can see how far down a bench press is taken relative to how close the bar is to the body. So exercise range of motion is specific to the constraints of the exercise and will be dependent on what exercise is chosen. Often, exercise range of motion is more of a concern when training for strength, because each lift will be defined by a specific set of rules which determine what range of motion we need to lift with. However, for hypertrophy training, we aren't concerned with lifting performance. We are more interested in how to best stress the muscle for structural adaptations. This leads us to the second subcategory, muscle range of motion, which is slightly different to exercise range of motion. Muscle range of motion refers to how much a particular muscle is being lengthened and contracted during an exercise. Two different exercises may take the same muscle through a different range of motion, even if both exercises are performed with full exercise range of motion. For example, a chest fly will take the pecs through a larger range of motion than a barbell bench press, even if both exercises are performed with full range. When training for hypertrophy, we are more concerned with muscle range of motion because this is what will determine the stress on the muscle and the adaptations that take place. Our muscles don't grow because we hit depth in a squat, our muscles grow when there is sufficient stress to the tissue. So how does range of motion influence muscle hypertrophy? Well, generally speaking, we see greater muscle growth per set using a larger range of motion. In other words, training with full exercise range of motion seems to be superior to partial range. This is a fairly consistent finding in the scientific literature, and it is difficult to make a rational case for using partial range of motion. So while we understand that more range of motion is generally superior for hypertrophy, we don't fully understand the mechanisms by which this occurs. We will now explore some potential mechanisms that could explain why full range of motion results in superior growth, although it should be understood that these are theoretical mechanisms rather than definitive reasons. The first potential reason is that full range of motion may recruit a larger number of muscle fibers. More specifically, certain muscle fibers may be more or less active during certain portions of a lift. Therefore, if we train through a full range of motion, we are more likely to stress all muscle fibers and experience a more hypertrophic stimulus across the span of the entire region of the muscle. If we only train with a partial range, we may only be maximally stressing certain fibers that are highly active during that specific range, while others are not largely involved. Another potential mechanism to support full range of motion is that training a muscle through a larger range of motion will stress the muscle at a longer length. There is some convincing evidence suggesting that training a muscle when it is at a long muscle length seems to result in greater hypertrophy than training at shorter muscle lengths. So when we train with a full range of motion, it stresses the muscle at a longer length and likely results in greater hypertrophy outcomes. And the last potential mechanism that may explain the superiority of greater range of motion is stretch under load. This is similar to the previous point we discussed about training a muscle at long lengths. However, here we are referring to the actual stretching of the tissue being somewhat hypertrophic. We have some evidence to suggest that active stretch under load seems to have some hypertrophic effect independent of other variables. So we now understand that greater range of motion is probably going to result in a greater hypertrophic stimulus than partial range for the most part. However, range of motion also has an indirect influence on hypertrophy via its effects on fatigue and injury risk. When training with a larger range of motion, we cannot handle the same load as if we were to reduce the range. For example, we can lift more weight if we only take a bench press halfway down to our chest compared with full range where we touch the chest. Therefore, each repetition of partial range requires more load to be lifted. This will likely result in greater joint stress with every repetition performed and also greater systemic fatigue. So trainees may not be able to handle as much total weekly volume when training with partial range as they would be able to with full range of motion. This is because the threshold for injury and excessive systemic fatigue will be lower since each set is more taxing and fatiguing. Since we know that volume is the primary driver of hypertrophy, this can indirectly limit our hypertrophy progress over time. Another benefit in using full exercise range of motion is that it standardizes what range we are lifting through. For example, if we touch the bar to our chest with every rep of a bench press and lock out the elbows with each rep at the top of the lift, we keep the range of motion consistent between each set and each week over time. This makes it easier for trainees to track performance progress and reduce unwanted variation in training from session to session. While so far it seems that greater range of motion is superior in all ways, is it possible for range of motion to be too excessive? The answer is yes. If we take the exercise range of motion too far, we can probably make the hypertrophic stimulus worse and the fatigue cost greater. Basically, we want to avoid excessive range to the point where we are no longer taking the muscle through a greater range, but instead we are now stressing other tissues. For example, if we perform dips too deep, we will no longer be lengthening the chest, delts, and triceps, but instead we are distributing more stress on the scapular and shoulder joints in a highly compromised position. This will mean that tension is taken off the target muscles and instead being distributed to the joints and connective tissue. This will probably increase injury risk and result in a poorer hypertrophic stimulus for the target muscles. Another potential reason that range of motion may need to be limited is due to an individual's joint pain. Some exercises simply feel uncomfortable or painful for some trainees in certain ranges. This could be due to lingering injuries, old surgeries, or simply the individual's anatomical structure. If the trainee is using an appropriate load and controlled technique, and they feel some form of pain or discomfort through a full range of motion, then it is a reasonable decision to avoid that particular range for that particular exercise. They could either switch the exercise to reap the benefits of full range of motion, or they could simply train through the range of that exercise that feels safe and healthy. So what practical recommendations can we conclude from all of this information? Well, quite clearly we should probably train with a full exercise range of motion if we want to maximize muscle growth. This will provide a greater hypertrophic stimulus per set and minimize local and systemic fatigue. However, if full range of motion causes joint irritation or range of motion is excessive, then it is probably best to only work through the safe and effective range for your specific individual needs. Range of motion also has implications for exercise selection. Although this is off topic for this video, we may want to strategically implement some exercises which involve greater muscle range of motion compared with others. Even if we train through a full exercise range of motion, some exercises naturally allow the muscle to be taken through a larger or smaller range. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.